Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching a brand new edition of India's World with me, Rausan Pereira. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, a former defense secretary and intelligence officer accused of committing human rights violations, has won Sri Lanka's presidential elections. His main opponent, Sajith Premadasa of the ruling United National Party, conceded defeat on Sunday. Rajapaksa led the Sri Lankan armed forces during the end of the country's decades-long civil war, while his older brother, Mahinda Rajapaksa, was president. The Sri Lankan armed forces defeated the Tamil Tigers, ending the violent conflict in 2009. Rajapaksa's win signals the return of power for the controversial family, hailed by many for ending the civil war, but also remembered for brutal acts against minorities and dissidents. Rajapaksa won with more than 52% of the nearly 16 million possible votes, according to final results released on Sunday by Sri Lanka's Election Commission. He defeated Sajith Premadasa by about 10 percentage points. On this edition of India's World, we will analyze the presidential elections in Sri Lanka. Joining me on the program today are KP Fabian, former ambassador, Shakti Sinha, foreign affairs and strategic affairs expert, Harshvi Pant, head strategic studies, Observer Research Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. First, let's try and analyze and understand the results of the recently held presidential elections in Sri Lanka.
Well, first thing to say is that it was a free and fair election. There were one or two incidents, but it was a free and fair election, and all of us have to recognize that and accept it. But second thing is that, he got, that is Rajapaksa, he got votes more from the Sinhala majority, and even there, in the Sinhala community, there is a slightly extremist part of that community that voted for him. And the rival, he got Premadasa, he got substantial votes both from the north, 5 districts, and the east, 3 districts. So it's a polarizing vote. And there are concerns, especially among the minority communities, about what might happen. But there are also international concerns also.
All right. So before we come to the international concerns, let's talk about some of the domestic aspects first. Mr. Sinha, like the ambassador pointed out, it seems like a vote that is clearly divided. Northeast has voted in favor of Premadasa, and of course the Sinhala majority has voted in favor of Rajapaksa. Is this also going to reflect in the way the country is run going forward, division of powers and so on and so forth?
In fact, that is a serious issue because one, it is also ethnic, as you rightly pointed out, that the North and East have not just voted for Premadasa, he was polling something like 80% of the votes in the provinces, while Sajith was winning his provinces by 55-60% votes only. Not Sajith, sorry, Gotabaya. So you can see that this kind of polarization has happened. It's a reflection of what is happening, has happened in Sri Lanka over the decades. And the former president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, has clearly said that they want to revisit the 19th Amendment, which curtailed the power of the president, for the simple reason that they believe, the old Sinhala belief, that a centralized Sinhala state is what Sri Lanka should be. And that's where the whole trouble starts. Though I must say, Gotabaya's first statement was a very good statement. He said, I'm the president of all of Sri Lanka and not just those who voted for me. So I'm also for them. And that we will not discriminate based on language, religion, etc. That's a very positive sign from his side because he has to look forward for development. So he needs, and that's a stable polity. But whether the people on his side, the extremists that Ambassador Fabian just mentioned, they would allow this kind of normalcy to develop, that is what we'll have to watch for.
All right. So what is the biggest challenge as far as the new president is concerned, Professor Pant? And let's not forget, the election was fought in the backdrop of the Easter bombings and the attacks that killed over 250 people. All that was taken to the people. Are we going to see Sri Lanka now being governed with an iron fist?
Well, I think that was the larger meta-narrative of this election, that a lot of people, especially the Sinhalese majority, felt that they were under siege. Those bombings were seen as a very, as a marker, perhaps in the phase that was emerging out of the civil war, and then finally it was assumed that the country was getting normal, and then you had those Easter bombings, Easter Sunday bombings, and I think it reflected a certain sense of dissonance within the wider community that perhaps the weakness of the state was leading to these kind of actions. And I think that there was also, let's be honest about it, a sense in the wider country that the country was not governed effectively, because I think the security conundrum, especially exemplified by the Easter Sunday bombings, underscored something very fundamental. The reasons for it, that you had clear warnings, intelligence signs were there. India was telling them that it was happening. Their internal intelligence was telling them that something is going to happen, and yet the country was, the decision-making apparatus was divided between the two power centers. So I think there was a sense that governance has been at stake in the country. It was not governed effectively, and so perhaps you vote for a strong man, you vote for a strong candidate who has demonstrated in bringing the country back towards a sense of normalcy after the decades of Tamil tigers and after decades of civil war. So what is what one looks at today is a country that is trying to come out from this sense of insecurity, and once again has voted for a candidate that could demonstrate his effectiveness or his potential effectiveness in dealing with the situation on the ground. How effective he would be depends on whether his first statement that he mentioned of taking into consideration the sentiment of those who did not vote for him into account. Because ultimately, if that does not happen, then the entire process of reconciliation will not happen, and therefore the country would not become a normal country that perhaps many in Sri Lanka want it to be.
Okay, all right. Let's talk about some of the international implications. Let's talk about India first. Ambassador, should we, I wouldn't use the word concerned as yet, but should we be watchful of what's likely to happen in the days to come in Sri Lanka because of what we've seen in the past from the Rajapaksa regime?
Well, before talking about the international concerns and especially about India, let me just add one point. Now, we have one Rajapaksa as president. We are likely to have another Rajapaksa as Prime Minister.
Yeah.
You know whom, Mahinda. And then there is a third Rajapaksa, Basil. He will also likely to have an important position.
Maybe so defense or interior. Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. Yeah.
Frankly, between you and me, it doesn't matter what position. It will be the three Rajapaksas who will be, in charge. So that is one aspect of it. Now, coming to the international concerns, there are concerns in the United States because of the human rights record of the elected president. But coming specifically to India, India will, as I said earlier, will certainly accept the democratic verdict and do its utmost to develop good relations, good neighborly relations between its neighbor Sri Lanka. But going by the past, and if you know the past of a person, you may have some idea of the future direction, though it's possible to change course. Now, going by the past, the Rajapaksas have shown a definite trend towards getting closer to China and less close to India, and that you can see in that Hambantota port project. In fact, it has been given a name, Mahinda, you see, and then they got into a debt trap, and they have given so much of land on a 99-year lease, which is, when you look at human longevity, it is forever. Then they built an airport at Matale, again, to sort of promote the domestic political interests of Rajapaksa. Well, that also hasn't worked out well. So this debt trap is a serious matter, but of course, China will maneuver with considerable skill and try to sort of convince the Sri Lankan leadership there is no real debt trap, everything can be adjusted. And also, the president-elect as defense secretary, sometimes the Indian newspapers refer to him as defense minister. That is wrong. Well, he was defense secretary, but since the president himself was the defense minister, you can say that he was virtually the defense minister, but technically he was defense secretary. So he had come to Delhi, and we had then, I think it was 2014, I think, we had then shared our concern about naval visits by warships of PLA of China. And within a week he went back, and within a week there was 2 naval vessels did visit Colombo. So we were not at all pleased. So there is that background to it. So India will have to watch very carefully. But as said, it will be in the interest of the President to focus on development. And to focus on development, he will have to reconcile with the minorities. And internationally, he has to emerge as generally acceptable rather than seen as too focused on building up relations with a particular country.
Right.
But we don't know. Let's see.
Let's see. Okay, talking about let's see, can the benefit of the doubt be given to the new Rajapaksa at the helm? Because Prime Minister Modi congratulated him on Sunday. He responded, and he also replied and responded to Prime Minister's congratulatory note on social media. Can we see the Rajapakshas making peace with India going forward, Mr. Sinha?
Actually, making peace is a very strong word you are using. It's not that we are not at peace, but yes, better relationship. Now, I would give slight benefit of doubt for a number of reasons. One, we have been in touch. Mahinda Rajapaksa visited India as a guest a couple of years ago. When Prime Minister Modi went to Sri Lanka earlier this year, the first visitor to visit after the Eastern bombings, he did meet Mahinda Rajapaksa also. And the President-elect, now President, in his reply to Mr. Modi's tweet, referred to India as a relative. And for the last couple of years, even though they have been saying that you don't understand us properly, you've not made efforts to understand us properly, Gotabaya Rajapaksa has also said that China also doesn't understand us properly. So he's not, yes, the kind of purse strings that China brings along, we simply don't have deep pockets like that. Let's be frank. Debt trap is for the next generation to handle. I'll get away for the time being. So politicians do have a much shorter time horizon. And China does, in that sense, offer them attractive packages. So, which is why even the last government really could not handle the China conundrum very well. Because the kind of legal agreements that entered into China, you can't get away from it. But as I said, looking at the needs for Sri Lanka and much greater need for regional economic cooperation, I would feel investments, big ticket, China, I can understand. But on a whole host of other issues, obviously India is very, very important. Right. So I think they would not try to become as polarizing as Mahinda Rajapaksa had become for some time.
Proximity also is a big factor, because let's not forget, we are almost next door neighbors. It's just a very small channel that is dividing the two countries.
And you visit each other. Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa is very devotee of Tirupati. So, you have very strong links at that level also going along. So while you may politically want to push back a little bit, this time they did not mention India at all as interfering in Sri Lanka. In fact, they blamed the previous government. India gave you the inputs, you did not act on the inputs. So in that sense...
So looking for better times ahead really under this regime as well is both India and Sri Lanka. But let's bring in China into the picture. The ambassador was speaking about it, about how those 2 submarines in fact landed on the shores of Sri Lanka without India even knowing about it. How much of a concern or is that going to be going forward, Professor, with, let's not forget, Maldives was a setback for China. So this is a new avenue. This could be seen as a new avenue for the Chinese to re-enter and, try to dominate in the Indian Ocean region once again.
Well, China is already there in the Indian Ocean. China is a big player in our neighborhood, and we can't get away from that. And all our neighbors are also very adept in playing China and India when the time comes. So it's not as if Rajapaksa is going to do anything different from what his predecessors have not done, or that other actors in the region are not doing. I think where perhaps, as I think Shakti was pointing out, where perhaps things may have changed a bit is that there is a better recognition about some of India's red lines, that there are some concerns that India has which perhaps need to be taken into account. And I think the way the last 5 to 6 years have evolved, both first under Mahinda Rajapaksa and then under Sirisena, I think tells you a story that you can't really while India is a neighbor, India is a very important neighbor, India is a very important partner, the kind of assets that India brings to the table cannot be replicated by the Chinese. At the same time, China is now so entrenched in Sri Lanka that even a government like Sirisena's, which many called very pro-India, also could not really get rid of the China syndrome. So there is pressure on all our neighbors in terms of how they engage with China and India, and almost all of them inevitably try to use one card or the other as convenient to them. But I think in this case now, as a new administration comes into being, that administration will have to look at the kind of fault lines that we were talking about within the country, and how do you go over those fault lines and build a future that is for everyone, as Mr. Rajapaksa seems to have suggested. And I think there perhaps India's role would become again very critical, because India is an important interlocutor in North and East. And I think that the way India takes that conversation forward will help Mr. Rajapaksa. So perhaps he might be more sensitive to Indian concerns. As also, I think, putting all of Sri Lanka's eggs in Chinese basket may not be a very sound strategy for a small country like Sri Lanka. So I think any sound administrator would like to reach out to other countries, India, including other Western countries. Sri Lanka has had traditionally very strong ties with Western nations. It's only now in the recent past, when the criticism of Mr. Rajapaksa's handling of LTT conflict, that has sort of led to such certain amount of deterioration. So I think presumably you can expect him to also reach out to the US, which has been very harsh on him and his ability to shape Sri Lankan politics. So one can in the future look for him, he can potentially look at India as one of the interlocutors that allows him to reach out to a wider world beyond China. So I think there are opportunities here, as when a new administration comes in, you look at the positives, and hopefully the positives will outweigh the negatives, and we will have a much more robust relationship than perhaps many of us are expecting at this point in time.
Absolutely. Perfect. So, that having been said, Ambassador, what is going to be the big focus area in the immediate near future as far as the new establishment is concerned? What's going to be the President's top focus?
Well, I just want to make a point that in regard to Sirisena, some of our scholars at that time, when he was elected, had overestimated his tilt towards India, though not the Ministry of External Affairs per se, but some of our scholars had said, now there will be a 180-degree turn. No, that was not the case. So what we have to understand is that, as already pointed out, there are certain geopolitical factors which make it necessary for Sri Lanka not to get too close either to India or to China, and to sort of navigate very carefully in the narrow waters which you mentioned.
Yes.
Which I think by and large Sri Lankan diplomacy is capable of. Now, as regards the President, well, he would need to restore confidence in him among the minorities. And the 19th Amendment was mentioned. Well, the 19th Amendment was about reducing the powers of the all-powerful President. We all know the background, There was a time under Bandaranaike when the Prime Minister appointed the President. Then later it was changed, and Jayawardene, he was the first executive president. And in Sri Lanka, the President towers above the Prime Minister and the rest of the structure, Now that they wanted to change, and now as they say, there is some thought of looking at it again.
Again, yeah.
Now that has to be done very sort of in a mature way. There may be need for some changes, but going back to the old system of a powerful, all-powerful executive presidency will be dangerous, and also because the point earlier I mentioned about the family. If you have got a Trimurti, reigning and ruling in Sri Lanka, that will not be good for Sri Lanka. And so apart from the restoration of the faith of the minorities, second is economic. The economy is not doing well. Inflation is there. They need more investment, employment, all that is there. And third, of course, is internationally. And then even the human rights violations, well, it is sort of still hanging fire You know what I mean? Though we should take note that India did, because of neighborly relations, did support Sri Lanka in the Human Rights Council and elsewhere, which was of great importance because, for others, well, if India is taking a line on Sri Lanka, well, India being the neighbor, India should know best.
Yeah.
Sort of. So that did help Sri Lanka in a big way. So that also is still hanging fire in a way.
Okay.
But I think there is scope for putting it all together in a way which will be good for Sri Lanka and good for Sri Lanka's economic progress, social harmony, and better relations with India and other countries. But whether this will actually happen or not, I am no prophet.
Okay, all right, we'll wait. Time will tell exactly which way Sri Lanka will go and which way Sri Lanka will tilt. But talking about the past, the human rights violations and all of that, how much is that going to play on the mind of the new president? How much of a concern, how much of an issue is that going to be going forward? And are the Western countries, now we've not focused much on the UK, the US and others, how much are they going to concentrate on this aspect in Sri Lanka?
It's the Western countries will be most worried about it actually, and they are the ones who have been talking about it all the time. As far as the neighbors are concerned, we have accepted that situation. Since many of us have gone through various kinds of insurgencies, and the LTT were terrible people. The kind of atrocities the LTT committed, not on the Sinhala, but on the Tamil community, the Tamil elite, the Tamil intellectuals, was terrible, terrible. So, inherently in Sri Lanka, human rights violations are relatively less of an issue than anywhere else. Gotabaya will have to be a domestic president primarily. If you see the tensions of the last government, the fact that Sri Sena and Vikram Singh are not natural allies. They represent two very different worldviews. They were forced to come together. The cohabitation did not work. Governance suffered. And therefore, as a reaction, Mahinda Rajapaksa could come back first to the local elections and now. So the primary task would be to establish governance within Sri Lanka, to establish confidence that the government can handle threats, that Easter Sunday will not be repeated. And in that sense, the foreign element would become relatively unimportant for them. As it is with China becoming the largest investor and the largest bilateral donor. Historically, it was Japan. China has become bilaterally the largest donor, however you define it. I would not call it actually because it is tied aid, so it's not really. But the way the world looks at it, fine. So in that sense, I don't think so that human rights violation, terrible as they were, and they were terrible, but I think they'll have to, in that sense, while try to reach out to the minority communities, the Tamils and unfortunately the Muslims were also Tamils, but historically colonialism separated them by calling them Moors and treating them separately. He would definitely have to reach out to them for that purpose. But overall, I would still feel that will be a domestic governance, security, strong state agenda that will drive the government.
Okay, all right. Closing comment now from you, Professor, with the best way forward and what is it that we can expect going forward as well?
Well, I think Mr. Rajapaksa has come back to par, after he was and his family was thrown out from the governance structures in the past 5 years, and I think he has come back with a sound mandate, but it's a fractured mandate, and therefore for him to come back and establish himself as a leader of all Sri Lankans should be a top priority, because that would also allow him to engage with the wider international community as well as transcend some of the problems of some of these human rights issues that are still hanging over him. So clearly this should be an imperative for him, and this would also allow him to be more at ease in terms of fulfilling the developmental agenda, wherein he could involve not only China but also other countries like India and Western nations, which have traditionally been strong supporters of Sri Lankan democracy. So clearly what we are looking at now is a president whose priorities will be domestic, but in sort of fulfilling those priorities, he would need international help. And therefore, for him to sort of disengage from his past would be a very important initiative. And if he is able to do that successfully, I think he would be able to overcome much of these, a number of these questions that have come today as he gets sworn in as the new president of Sri Lanka.
All right. So it's still initial days. Of course, we'll have to wait and see what happens in Sri Lanka, but there is tremendous potential to repair some of the damage of the past and take Sri Lanka forward in the right direction is what the panelists are suggesting. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of India's World. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. We'd like to hear from you as well. Do share your feedback and your suggestions with us. Our email ID is indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. You can also tweet to us using our Twitter handles at FRP09 and at Rajya Sabha TV. That's it from me. See you again next time.